Hello to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and Facebook. Welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Browne with my co-host tonight, Libby Davies. Hello there, Libby. And
Hi,
hello. And I'm joining you tonight from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Well, hello, Robin, and hello to all our guests and viewers. I'm joining from the unceded traditional territory and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish peoples.
So October is Islamic History Month in Canada. And while it is a time to mark and celebrate the contributions of Canada's diverse Muslim populations, 15 years after the federal government proclamation establishing the month, we are seeing a rise in hate crimes and discrimination against Muslims. This evening, we are joined by a powerhouse panel who will discuss this important issue and what can be done about it. So welcome to Senator Salma Ataullahjan. Senator Ataullahjan was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 2010 as Canada's first senator of Pakistani origin. Senator Ataullahjan is committed to issues affecting women, youth, and the world's most vulnerable. She is chair of the Senate Committee on Human Rights, which is currently studying Islamophobia in Canada. Welcome, Senator. Nuzhat Jafri is the executive director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. She also serves on the board of directors of the Pluralist Foundation and has served as chair and member of several other nonprofit boards. She is an untiring advocate for human rights, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Welcome, Nuzhat. Monia Mazigh immigrated from Tunisia to Canada in 1991. She was catapulted onto the public stage in 2002 when her husband, Meher Arar, was deported to Syria, where he was tortured and held without charge. She campaigned tirelessly for his release. Monia holds a PhD in finance from McGill University and is the author of 3 books, Hope and Despair, a memoir about her pursuit of justice, and the novels Mirrors and Mirages, and Hope Has 2 Daughters. She is also a columnist for rabble.ca. Thanks for joining, Monia. And welcome back to Rabble's parliamentary reporter, Karl Nerenberg. Karl is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and filmmaker working in both English and French. He's Rabble's senior parliamentary correspondent and a regular Off the Hill panelist. Great to have you back, Karl. Special welcome also to everyone who registered for this event on Zoom. Please participate in the chat or ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we will do our best, as always, to address your questions. And for those of you watching on Facebook, hello to you. A reminder that if you'd like to participate in future events, simply sign up to Rabble's free newsletter to get a notification for the Zoom. Now I'm going to turn it over to Libby to kick off tonight's panel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robin. And as you noted, Robin, October is National Islamic History Month. With Islamophobia and racism on the rise in Canada, our panel tonight tackles the questions of what cultural responses and political actions are needed to counter this trend. So we're going to begin our first question. I'm going to turn to Senator Ataullahjan. And to start us off, because I think we want to hear about what you're doing with your Senate committee. The Senate Committee on Human Rights recently completed public hearings across the country on Islamophobia in Canada. I think this has been a groundbreaking effort, and while it has had media coverage, not necessarily all of our audience will be aware of the committee and its work. So, Senator, to begin, maybe you could tell us, why did the all-party committee decide to tackle this issue, and what did you hear?
Well, good evening, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. So one day I was just looking at the news, and I was just, looking at the numbers and the amount of Muslims killed, and I was shocked to find out that the most Muslims killed in a G7 country was in Canada. And none of my colleagues were aware of this also. We were in the process of finishing, our previous studies and making a calendar for the new year. And I thought, I think we should look at Islamophobia, how it's impacted the Muslim community in Canada. We started off in June, had 2 hearings in Ottawa, and then we went to Vancouver, Edmonton, Quebec City, and Toronto to speak to people on the ground. And it's an ongoing study. We probably will continue the study till December.
And what did you hear from the various witnesses or briefs that came forward?
What we heard is that almost 2 decades of Islamophobia is taking a toll on the mental well-being of Muslims, whether it's at work or whether it's at school. And, you know, we're hearing about the increased Islamophobic rhetoric, you know, and the portrayal of Muslims in the media. And we found out that for Muslim women who wear the hijab, their experience is the worst. And if you were Black and a young woman wearing the hijab, their experience. So it was like that one evening in Edmonton, we all just sort of sat in shocked silence as we listened to the testimony. And there was a lot of emotion there that day, raw emotion. Yes. And we all had to sort of take a deep breath and just try and continue to listen to the difficult testimony. It was similar in Quebec City. It was similar in Toronto. You know, it seems Islamophobia impacts women, especially if you choose to wear a hijab. We didn't even get to the niqab issue. We will at some point, but this was just how difficult it was for women who wore hijab, the abuse that they faced on a daily basis. We heard how men were perceived, Muslim men mostly are perceived as being terrorists.
Mm-hmm. For those in our audience who are not familiar, you know, a parliamentary committee, whether it's in the Senate or the House of Commons, is a fairly formal structure. It's a fairly formal setup for people to come forward and share information that is really personal and emotional and even traumatic is really a very difficult thing to do. So I hope we can all appreciate what this means, you know, for people to come forward publicly and to actually share their experience as Muslim Canadians and what they're facing. Now, you, Senator, you finished the hearings, and at some point you will be crafting recommendations that go to the government. And maybe you could just spend a minute or two explaining that process so people can understand, you know, what it is that a Senate committee, it's an all-party committee, which I think is very important for people to note. Hopefully it's a unanimous report. It isn't always, but you hope to bring your report together, I think you said by December, and then what's the process after that?
So we finished our public hearings, which means we finished our traveling, but we're continuing with the hearings every Monday. We continue to have our hearings, and we will continue because this still, like when I started these hearings, I thought it was, simple, straightforward. But now what we're grappling with is the term Islamophobia. We find that in itself is not enough. Maybe that's something we can discuss later. But once we've, drafted the report, the Senate committee looks at it, we table it, and then at the end of all our committee reports, there's recommendations put to the government, and the government has to respond to that. So we're hoping we will have the report by spring.
Right. And so the government is obliged, it's not voluntary, they are obliged to respond to the parliamentary committee report, and then that's usually made public. And I have to say that in my experience, sometimes parliamentary committee reports can carry a lot of weight because it does come from all party representation. It comes from the witness hearings as you've described to us. So I hope it's a very good vehicle to bring this message into the parliamentary world so that all parliamentarians will understand about the rise of Islamophobia in Canada. So I think it's wonderful that you're doing that. And I'm sure it's been a very intense process that you've gone through.
It has been. It's been, Libby, to be brutally honest, in the committee itself, and this was expressed by Senator Jaffer, while we've had some senators, of course, this is, the Human Rights Committee, the senators is, no party really takes a position. We all agree, human rights, you can't be partisan about human rights. But the thing that has disappointed Senator Jaffer and myself is we didn't have enough senators wanting to travel with us.
Really?
And I must say that I was a bit disappointed with that. And, that made me think, what's at play here?
So does
And
that mean that sometimes it was just the two of you, Senator Jaffer and
no,
yourself?
there was Senator Jaffer, myself, and Senator Martin, Senator Arnott. Different senators joined us at different time. I also recognize the fact that sometimes, you have commitments and it's not possible to be, everywhere. So we did have Senator Gerber, different senators in different, but the most we had was, there was 5 of us at one time, while the committee has 9 members. And, people you talk to and deal with, they're smart and they're savvy, and they would ask us, where's the rest of the committee?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you raised that. I'll turn it over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you, Senator, for that context. We want to bring Monia and Nuzhat in because we want to turn now to the question of the circumstances and factors contributing to the rise of Islamophobia in Canada. So things like, when did this rise start, and is it just more of what's been going on, or is it different? So let's start with Monia. What are your thoughts?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for having me at your podcast. I'm very happy to be with you, Robin and Libby, and the rest of my co-panelists. I look forward to a great discussion this evening. Where did this rise? There is a simple answer to this, but there is also a more complicated one. I will start basically with the simple answer. Maybe for average Canadian or for the average citizen of this world, or especially here, I'm talking about the Western world, I think people start hearing about Islamophobia, especially, I would say, after 9/11. I mean, it doesn't mean that it didn't exist before, but I think people start reporting and talking and using, even myself, I wanted really to use something, a word, and this is where I start using Islamophobia. So I think that's basically, maybe it gives an idea of how our world shifted before 9/11, after 9/11. The fact that those people who committed the terrorist act were Muslim, I think that somehow gave some sort of a carte blanche for the rest of the population to say, well, we have the right to treat you as violent, as extremists, as this and that, right? It's some sort of a not a feedback, but sort of reaction, right? So I think this is the simple sort of answer to your question. I think there is another, and I will try to be brief here because we want to hear from everyone else. But I think the more sort of complex and answer is that Islamophobia is very, very old. It's if you hear about someone called Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism, for example, and he's this professor, American professor from Palestinian origin, he spoke, maybe without naming it as Islamophobia, but he spoke about those stereotypes around Arab, Muslim in media, the framing of the Muslim personalities in the general imagination, in books, in arts, and of course also in politics, in media. So yeah, Islamophobia existed. It's really like, if you look at the colonization project in the Middle East, you find a lot of Islamophobia over there. So basically, yeah, here we are today.
Thank you, Monia. And Nuzhat, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Robin and Libby and my wonderful co-panelists for giving us this opportunity to talk to you. So I'm here from the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And the first time I remember actually having to deal with it was during the first Gulf War. So we started to hear from mothers that their children were being attacked in the schoolyard and they were being called names because some of them were named Hussein, for instance, and remember Saddam Hussein? So we started to hear about anti-Muslim sentiment even back then.
And
But
can you remind folks when the first Gulf War was?
it was in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so I think, you know, we were experiencing it then. Our organization, our members were experiencing it then. But as Monia said, Islamophobia has been with us for a very, very long time. And a lot of it has to do with depictions of ourselves, of Muslims, in the media, and how people talk about us and how they attribute violence and terrorism with Islam, and that oftentimes they believe that Islam propagates violence. So not only do they believe it, but when they see a news story about some kind of a terrorist attack where the perpetrator happens to be Muslim, right away they identify the perpetrator as Muslim, as Islamic terrorism, Islamist terrorism. And so the words Muslim and Islam almost become synonymous with the way we're portrayed. And so it's a very important thing to remember that the perpetuation of Islamophobia, you know, comes through many sources, including the media, but we know that there's a whole Islamophobia industry whose main focus is to, you know, spread anti-Muslim feelings, sentiments, actions, and the industry is well documented in a recent book by Dr. Jasmine Zine. If you get a chance to read it, it's phenomenal. I mean, it permeates all industries, but particularly the media, academic campuses, influencers, you know, very right-wing, conservative, extremist influencers. And so they have a following, and unfortunately, that's contributing to a rise in well, basically, you know, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Muslim extremism. And I would say that now it's sort of moving towards, you know, fascist authoritarianism, and it's really scary. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Nuzhat, for that context, and to both of you. And I'm actually going to come back to Monia because I want to get into this question of the context, and particularly the role of the media that you both mentioned, and what that means. Because Monia, you've written extensively critiquing the role of the media in fomenting racism and Islamophobia. So just ask you to speak a little bit more on that in terms of what you've learned about that critique of the role that the media plays.
It is interesting because the media role has been always to inform, to strengthen democracy, to question the powerful. It is ironic to see how sometimes the media sided with the powerful, sided with the government into sharing this sort of rhetoric about Muslim, about their violence, about their, you know, oppression of their women, because it is very important, I mean, to also to emphasize on how this sort of Islamophobia takes place, right? I mean, when it comes to men, and we are talking here about media, and I mentioned about Edward Said's work, for example, Hollywood played a very, very important role in demonizing and making the Muslim man, Arab, very violent. Nuzhat, you mentioned Saddam Hussein. If you look at this scary picture of, you know, some sort of bushy eyebrows and, you know, a big beard, these are characters that were very well portrayed in media, in Aladdin, for example, with Jafar, the evil, really, you know, character. And of course, I mean, there are many, many books that explore this in an academic way, in a very detailed way, to see how the male character, the Muslim, or, and I sometimes I mention Arab, but also in Muslim in general, but also Arab in particular, has been portrayed by the media. I mean, very recently I was listening to one of these actors, new actor, and he is Muslim and he said, like, he refused to play the role of terrorist because this is what it has been giving to him all the time. So now if we look at, for example, at the portrayal of Muslim women, right, it is not anyhow different or better because they are framed into this box of submissive, oppressive, but also sexualized, you know, hidden, erotic, and this is bring us again to these very old roots of Islamophobia with the Orientalist painter. Go to Paris and you will see many famous paints by Eugène Delacroix, you know, having all these women in Algiers, and these women, they are, you know, in their harem, and this is, you know, nobody entered the harem, but this is just a lot of imagination of these men who would love to go and enter and see how these women are living. Later on, I mean, there are studies that prove that some of these women are not even real. I mean, they were sometimes, you know, sex worker, or, you know, some women that would never really represent the reality, but they will do it there because of the money. So anyway, it is, I mean, I spoke about, yeah, the oppression, the submissive, the sexualization. Today, I mean, we can see how Islamophobia also in the media plays very, very well. The fact that some of the, I mean, I'll give you a very simple example. Very recently here in Ottawa, where I live, there is, at the back to school, there was a young Syrian boy, refugee actually, who came into town and he started school, and he was attacked by people in the school, and everybody tried to hide, you know, from the police, from the school administration. They tried to make it as, you know, a robbery or as a sort of a bullying. But those boy kept telling, while hitting the little, like the 15-year-old boy, you know, his attacker kept asking him, "Are you an Arab? Are you a Muslim?" Mm-hmm. And under a lot of pressure, you know, so basically, and where is the role of the media? You know, it's only afterwards that the media came. And so I think, you know, the media, unfortunately, falls into those same stereotypes about men, about women, not explaining as much, not exposing the Islamophobia mm-hmm. as it should be to the readers, to the listeners, and to the general population.
Well, thank you so much, Monia, for that sort of historical context, as well as bringing it into a real community perspective about what's happening today. And I'd like to turn to Karl now and sort of turn it over to a more political side, I guess, because Karl, as a journalist, you've had a long history of reporting for both mainstream and independent media. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts of how some politicians, not all, but some, have tried to exploit Islamophobia for their own benefit. And for example, I mean, I think we could look to the most recent situation in the Quebec election, which I know that you paid a lot of attention to. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of the political side of how it's being exploited?
I'll back up a little bit before the most recent Quebec election and cast your mind back to the 2015 federal election in Canada. Remember that during that election campaign, a woman, a Muslim woman who wears the niqab, wanted to swear the oath of allegiance for citizenship wearing her niqab. I'd never heard that had come up one way or the other, or why anybody should care. And this became a cause célèbre, whether she should be allowed. And as I remember it, honestly, she got a court ruling saying that there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, she could privately identify herself, and then she could wear, if she's wearing a niqab, why not? And this caused sadly, the Prime Minister of the day, Stephen Harper, and the leader of the Bloc Québécois, Gilles Duceppe, got themselves on a high horse. I think they saw a vote-getting opportunity here among certain people. In that same election campaign, one party had a barbaric practices tip line, which was sort of generally against anybody your neighbors youth found weird and different and foreign. It wasn't, they didn't say Muslims, and it could have been targeted at say Hindus from India or Buddhists from Sri Lanka or from Burma, but still it was targeted against people who old stock Canadians find strange and weird, and they can start calling up and saying, gee, I think my neighbors are cooking something that smells funny, or I hear funny sounds from their house. Maybe that's a barbaric practice, and we can start persecuting these people. You know, in the case of the woman who wore a niqab and the campaign, they were doing television advertising campaigns. Politicians were bringing this up in debates. Every time the sitting prime minister of the time would go into a debate, especially in French, but both in French and English, he'd say, I'm in favor of a person swearing an oath of allegiance having an uncovered face. Like suddenly this became a big issue that he cared about all of a sudden. It hadn't occurred to him before.
And bring this forward now to the Quebec election.
So in the Quebec
Karl,
election,
what have we learned, if anything?
So in the Quebec election, there's a long history of what's going on in Quebec, but in Quebec somehow the issue of strangeness and difference and people having publicly displaying some kind of religious affiliation gets mixed up with a lot of questions, one of which is Quebecers who are worried about their identity. Here's the irony of this whole situation in Quebec. The people who want to go around persecuting people, telling a woman who wears a hijab that she can't teach school. And by the way, I have a granddaughter who goes to a French school in Ottawa where the majority of the women, their parents, volunteers, and teachers wear hijabs, and many of the children, they're loving, wonderful, good teachers. Our granddaughter loved many of her teachers, Muslim teachers. But so that really got to me that they wanted to persecute these people. But the pretext that they make is, we're not against this religion or that, although it's completely transparent that they are. And when they let their guard down, the premier of Quebec would say things like, people are going to come here and they're going to bring their violent ways, and we're peaceful people. And then none of them work and they don't learn French, all of which is untrue. But they say it's based on, they use the French word laïcité, meaning we want to have an entirely secular society. They're distorting that idea. When I was involved in that movement in the 70s and 80s, it was to be inclusive. People like me said, we shouldn't have officially religious institutions that exclude people. We should have inclusive institutions that have no religious character, that allow people of many different religions and backgrounds or no religion to coexist together. Now they want to use that same principle of diversity and inclusiveness to persecute people. And really, they say everybody who is essentially, what they're saying by laïcité is totally a lie and hypocritical. They're saying anybody who's not of our Christian white background and practice is sufficiently different that we can't allow them even to look the way they want to look, even to dress the way they want to dress. It's frightening, but it works.
So just very quickly, Karl, so given the election result in Quebec, then as you say, it resonated and it was successful. So this is obviously a huge challenge politically as well as culturally in terms of how this issue is exploited for political purpose. So
you know what happened in Quebec? And it's going to happen. It can happen elsewhere in Canada. The city of Montreal completely rejected this. In the city of Montreal, they elected, except for 2 members of the Coalition Avenir Québec, the governing party, all the other seats, with 27 other seats, went either to the Liberal Party, whose leader is a woman of color, or to the Socialist Québec Solidaire, which rejected this completely. So the entire the governing party of Quebec came 3rd in the city of Montreal. They didn't even come 2nd place. They came I've never seen this in Quebec before. They have a huge majority. The governing party wins, and yet they're completely shut out of the metropolitan center, the heart and soul and center of Quebec, the center of its industry, commerce, and culture, all in Montreal. Many of these political leaders live in Montreal who spew this nonsense, but they're completely rejected by Montreal. And where do they get success? In many, many places in Quebec where they've never met a person from outside of their own background. where they've never laid eyes on a Muslim or anybody else who's not from their background. And we can see that reproduced in the States. That's how Trump won as well. Every single major city rejected Trump, even in Texas and in the South. And we saw that in Canada in 2015, where the party that talked this rhetoric was completely shut out in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and most other major cities.
Well,
so
very
it is
important
really, we're
distinction.
getting this, the situation where the people who are afraid and threatened by this phenomenon have absolutely no firsthand familiarity with diversity in Canada of any sort, religious or otherwise. And the people who live with it think is great or think is part of life. If your neighbors are Muslims, you realize these are good people. But if you're living somewhere, far away and never met one, you can be scared of them.
Thanks, Karl.
So sorry.
Yes, thank you for those observations, Karl. That kind of relates to our next question. We're going to get into government, but I want to just do a follow-up before that, which kind of relates actually, and that is Black folks, activists, when we talk about systemic discrimination, we're talking about systemic by state institutions. So like the police, right? The result of that is a disproportionate number of Black folks in jail. Discrimination by schools is a disproportionate number of Black students who are being streamed, expelled, that kind of thing. So I want to get your thoughts on that in terms of Islamophobia, because, for example, in Ottawa, we've had some data that came up from the Ottawa police on their use of force by race and identity, and it showed that they were disproportionately using force on Black, Middle Eastern, and Indigenous people. Now, they didn't say Muslim, they said Middle Eastern. Our school board also did data on, again, like things like expulsion, streaming, and again, they showed a disproportionate negative impact on Middle Eastern kids. But so I'm just want to get at the idea of, is the Islamophobia we're seeing, is it systemic at the state level? Let's start with Nuzhat.
So Robin, that's a really good question. I think that we do have systemic Islamophobia. Quebec is a very, very good example, where you have the state basically sponsoring or sanctioning an act of discrimination against, Muslim women who wear a headscarf. So that does exist. And in other sectors, whether it's in employment. So for instance, I'll give you an example. The federal government has the Employment Equity Act, and it covers federally regulated employers. It was, legislation passed back in the 80s by a conservative government of the day, very progressive at the time, but it hasn't kept pace with all of the demographic changes in Canada. And if you think about, systemic issues, it doesn't identify religious minorities or all the intersectional identities of individuals. So if you have a Black Muslim woman who is visible by how she dresses, her experiences in the workplace are very, very different, than another person who may have completely different systemic identities. And I would say that the systemic issue is that our way to capture data, to track progress, is systemically flawed. We don't really know what happens to people who might be, they're getting better in law enforcement at capturing data intersectionally, but it's a very new phenomenon at the systemic level for organizations to actually analyze the demographics of people who experience Islamophobic attacks, or also who is disproportionately affected. The documentation around that may be tracked through complaints to the police services. But again, another systemic issue is that our community members don't actually go to the police to file complaints, because systemically they believe that law enforcement agencies are not going to listen to them. And we have had examples of our own members, women who have gone to the police with their complaints and they're dismissed. So we have a lot of issues to deal with. I will stop there, but
thank you for that, and that's actually a great segue into bringing back the senator back in. Where are we now, sir? So Senator, Yes. So what actions do you want to see the federal government take to combat Islamophobia?
Well, the first action I would like to see this government take is the fact that they promised to appoint a special representative, and we're still waiting a year and a half for that representative. I mean, 1.5, almost 4% of the population of Canada, and it's that difficult to find someone. I have a hard time believing that. Just so from what we heard, some of the important things that have to be done. One is we have to educate the educators also on Islamophobia and what it means. Go into any of the classrooms in the big cities in Canada, and there are Muslim kids there who sometimes feel alienated. We went to a school where we spoke to about 25, 30 young, I'd say young girls and boys, and most of them had experiences of Islamophobia. The government needs to take a stand. The government needs to, you can enact all kinds of legislation you want, but unless, and put forward legislation, but unless you act upon it, it's just a useless piece of paper. So we have to have, the government has to maybe even look for a definition of Islamophobia. It's something that we in the committee, we are struggling with. Because we were told that, when you talk about a phobia, that means fear of something. So Islamophobia is someone who has a fear of Muslims, but that does not tell you the story of how that fear reflects on Muslims, on how they are treated because somebody is afraid of them. So now we're struggling that instead of calling our study Islamophobia, we're looking at anti-Muslim hatred. Was it anti-Muslim violence? We're just, within ourselves, we're kind of talking. And this is all from just hearing from people and their experiences and what they told us. So I think the government, it has to be the federal government, the provincial government, they all have to step in. And I remember I grew up in a convent school in Pakistan. And when we went to school once a week, we used to have what they used to call a moral lesson where you sat and discussed different issues. Maybe it's some time for us to have something like that in the classrooms once a week, once a month, because we're seeing Islamophobic incidents. We're seeing anti-Semitism is on a rise. We're seeing, Black racism is on the rise. So there's issues there which need to be confronted.
Well, I'm really glad that you raised the issue of the special representative on Islamophobia from the last federal budget, Senator, because that's exactly where I'm going to go now. Is sort of bringing this issue together. As you pointed out, there was first of all, the government announced permanent funding for a special representative on anti-Semitism in the 2022 budget. So that presumably has happened. And the establishment of a new representative of Islamophobia, which, as you pointed out, a year and a half later hasn't happened. But we also know that Black groups have called for the government to appoint a special representative on systemic anti-Black racism. I think many people are aware, or becoming more aware, that these issues of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and anti-Black racism, they intersect. So I want to put this to Karl and then back to you, Senator, in terms of this issue of how they intersect. So to Karl, how do you think these three representatives, assuming they all do actually begin working, how should they address this question of intersecting issues so they're not sort of working in silos?
And it would be very good if we did have them working together. I was sort of gratified. I mean, I would speak, I don't often do this, but I will speak as a Jew, admittedly very secular one, and one who's openly and has written critically of Israel and is not in the camp Israel right or wrong. But still, I remember being very glad to see years ago the Jewish community in France and the Islamic community in France band together against Mr. Le Pen and say, we have to stand together. We are both victims of his brutality. We're both victims of his rhetoric. Yeah, after all, Jean-Marie Le Pen said the Holocaust was just an incident. Why do we worry about it? but I think it would be great if they work together here, because there's too much of a huge gulf. I mean, the fact is really true that there is a big overlap between the Black community in Canada and the Islamic community, because there are many Islamic people are Black, and there is that overlap. But I think that the Canadian Jews, many in the more established part of my own community, feel very much a part of the establishment, as it were, of we've been here for a long time, we're part of the establishment, we're really part of the majority, and they get a rude awakening every once in a while when they realize that there's many who don't view us that way. And I would like them to try to, if we do have 3 representatives, that they do form a common office. I'll say that one challenge is, the biggest challenge they're going to have is between fighting hate speech, hate thought, hate propaganda, and the people who say, well, there's freedom of speech. Where do we draw the line, and where does freedom of speech become, calling fire in a crowded theater? And it is not a simple line, and it's not easy to draw. But I do think, and then you always get accused of, oh, you're being woke. Oh, this is wokeism. Oh, we're turning everybody into a big wokist. This is the Premier of Quebec always says that, and we can't be frank and honest and say what we really think and just be descriptive. I mean, are we supposed to hide the fact, if there's a bank robber who's a member of one of these groups and we report their ethnicity, is this something wrong with that? So I think that there would be a great challenge. I think it should be a challenge they should undertake right away and say,
Okay.
when is speech harmful?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Karl. And just to bring you in, Senator Ataullahjan, from the perspective of your Human Rights Committee, you've all raised the question of systemic racism, whether it's Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism. How do you see these representatives? Like, is it important that they tackle it from a systemic point of view as well as education?
It definitely is, and it's going to be challenging for whoever they appoint. There was also the issue raised that maybe they need more than one person. I think it might be too much work for just one person. Maybe 2 or maybe even 3. So one of the biggest difficulties, in my opinion, is that those who are the most affected by an issue often end up doing the necessary work to bring about change. And I'm so happy when I, as I am on this panel with fellow Muslims who are raising their voices to be heard. And as we heard from the school children, as we heard from all the women who we met. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, and being united and talking. I mean, it's not possible to talk with one voice, but to have many voices, raised. And I think, and for me personally, I would love to see the special representative as a woman. I think I would like to see that they appoint a woman, but I don't have any say in it. So,
thanks, Senator.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Senator. Before we get into some audience questions, we have one last question for all panelists, and this is: how challenging is it to bring together political parties to work together on countering Islamophobia? And we want to get into answers, so we'll go briefly. So let's reverse the situation and start with the senator, and then we'll go through everyone else.
Well, speaking from my experiences that ensuring basic human rights, it transcends political parties. And I see my fellow senators who are very, very supportive of the work that we do, but are actually taking an interest. And for some of them, it has been a learning curve too. I mean, there's, you hear about Islamophobia, discrimination that exists, but until you don't sit in front of somebody who opens up their heart and tells you, this is my experience, like we heard in Quebec from a mother who was abused in front of her 3 children. And when she called the police didn't want to charge the other woman. And after 45 minutes of talking, the police ended up charging her too.
Thank you, Senator. That's not an uncommon thing among us Black folks, also, that's for sure. So, Monia, how challenging is it to bring together political parties to work together on combating Islamophobia?
Well, unfortunately, it has been very, very challenging, especially on the in 2000 and after I think 19 or when Ikra Khalid, the Liberal MP, presented her motion to study, just to study the Islamophobia. It became very, very quickly a partisan kind of an issue. And as Karl was explaining, you know, in Quebec, for example, Islamophobia and women's Muslim women dress and headscarf and attire became something that politician would start having some sort of an auction, you know, whoever betting, whoever is putting more and doing more to prevent the women to wear whatever they want to wear. So I think it is challenging. I would like to bring an issue here that I didn't speak about, and I think it is very, very important. Speak a lot about Islamophobia. Basically, the elephant in the room here. It's the anti-terrorism legislation that was introduced in Canada in 2002, in 2001, actually, after 9/11, immediately after 9/11. And that was, at that time, it was anonymous. Unanimous, everybody on the parliament agreed that we really need those laws. What happened is that those laws were applied exclusively on Muslim. And if we talk about systemic, here we go. We have the best example of systemic racism, systemic Islamophobia. Imagine a law that targets only a population that happen to be Muslim and, you know, sometimes Black or Muslim, Middle Eastern, whatsoever, Arab. So I think this is really important. So when we want to be non-partisan, we can do it. But I think especially today, if we want to really raise the issue of, you know, how to combat Islamophobia, we have to re-examine the past. We have to re-examine, you know, what we have done to demonize our Muslim community, our Muslim Canadian, to go harass them, target them, you know, all these measures in the airport, everything, you know. Just take the anti-terrorism legislation. It has been applied only on Muslim Canadian, and this is really problematic. So yes, definitely, we need some sort of, those Muslim are Canadian before everything else, and we need, you know, really a commitment, not only from one party, not only for some, you know, pure electoralist winning some sort of games, but because we have a reputation. When there are 6 men who have been killed in a mosque, it was not a Canadian problem. It was really like a problem of Canada all over the world. Everybody heard about that. And I think our reputation as a G7 country that has the highest number of Islamophobic attack is problematic. So we don't really need just one party, you know, to bring this issue. We need the government, we need all parties to work together to make Canada a safer place and a more inclusive place for Muslim communities in particular.
Can I jump in and just say something very quick, briefly, Robert? Motion 103 that had recommendations, and I don't think they have enacted any of those recommendations. So sometimes, you know, things are done for a political purpose, and if there's recommendations, they're often ignored. And we need, you know, all parties and to get serious. You know, we don't want another piece of paper. We do not want thoughts and prayers anymore. We need serious action now.
No, thank you for that. All right, I see we're looking at our time. I'm going to go over to Libby for some audience questions.
Okay. All right. Well, we've had lots of comments coming in, Robin, and to our panelists. Maybe some of you have been following along the comments, and I just wanted to say one thing. That first legislation that Monia spoke about in 2001, it was a Liberal government. I remember when it was rushed through. I'm glad that I and the party that I was with voted against it, but it was just rushed through. And the fact that it's been so targeted in the way you describe is, I don't think most people know that, you know. So I think you've all brought forward some pretty very important information today. So let's get to a couple of questions that have come in. One question that's come in that I think follows up your discussion quite well, and that is somebody says, how can I as a Christian increase my solidarity with my Muslim brothers and sisters? So, what can people do to show their solidarity and support? Any of you who would like to jump in and make it brief?
The one thing I tell everyone is when I'm asked that questions is that our mosques are open to everyone. Take the time to find out about the religion and the people and what it means. And if you do see someone who is being abused, as is the case that we heard from many of the Muslim women, nobody comes to their aid. In Edmonton, when they were the young Muslim women were being kicked and they were lying on the ground and their hijabs being pulled, nobody came to their aid. And I know it can be difficult sometimes, but sometimes just to show a little bit of support would mean so much to everyone.
Anybody else?
I think one thing that we have learned is alliances are really, really useful. So we have many, many allies who are not Muslim. And we do a lot of education work. We deliver anti-Islamophobia workshops. And the majority of the people that we partner with are in different organizations and sectors of our communities, including law enforcement, for instance, school boards, the private sector companies. So that's a really important part of our work. So to the person who asked that question, invite us to do an Islamophobia 101 workshop for you, for your organization. Bring a group together and we can share a lot of really good information. And one of the things about these sessions is that it's an interactive workshop. We have a lot of dialogue and people learn things about Islam and Muslims that they don't know about because we are very little understood by our broader society. So that's just one example. But another thing that I always encourage people to do is if you meet someone, a colleague or someone on the bus or, in school who happens to be Muslim, sometimes you don't know whether a person is Muslim or not. But if you find out that they're Muslim, get to know them, get to know who they are. And that just starts a really different kind of interaction and your minds start to change if you had some preconceived notions about Islam and Muslims.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else care to make a comment or give an example of something that can be done to show alliance and solidarity? Otherwise, we can certainly move on to the next question.
I mean,
Anybody
just
else?
quickly,
Karl?
we're talking about getting to know people at a human level, which I've had the opportunity to do. But there's also, in terms of our knowledge of the world, I think many people are surprised, just people I know from my own background or from a sort of majority Canadian background, when we talk about who is the Islamic world. If you look at the Islamic world, where it's centered, is right across the northern part of Africa, all the way through the Arabian Peninsula, all the way through Western Asia, and then the heart, the biggest population, moving through Pakistan, India, which used to boast it had the largest Muslim population in the world, although a minority, Bangladesh, and then, of course, the largest Muslim country in the world, which few Canadians would pass this test. Which country in the world has the largest Muslim population? It's not anywhere in the Arab world, it's Indonesia. And so to understand the diversity and complexity of the Islamic world and the extraordinary cultural heritage. I mean, not only that, it supplied us with algebra and so many other basic concepts and the concepts of astronomy, but that it's a deep and rich and ancient culture that we well to be familiar with.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question, if we have some brief answers. And the question is, it's really sort of following up on the discussion that you got into on the media and the role of the media, which I think is very interesting. And the question is, are right-wing think tanks and their media cohorts the biggest problem in dealing with Islamophobia? So maybe, and Nuzhat, could we begin with you on that? Any observation or comment on that?
So when I was talking about the Islamophobia industry, one of the key players in that industry happen to be these media outlets. And they cause a lot of problems for us because they target people. And so then, there's doxing and harassment and, violence that basically chases us after someone in that world has said something about us, about Muslims or about individual Muslim women or community members. And it's very dangerous. A lot of the rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, is actually coming from that source. And because of the consumption of that information, I would say, yes, misinformation and disinformation about Muslims is cultivated there and then passed on. And it has a lot to do with money. We know that the social media platforms make a whole lot of money if they post something that makes you really angry. If it, conjures up hatred or negative feelings about different groups of people. So unfortunately, the business model, whether it's those folks that you mentioned, Libby, or just these, social media platforms, the media, I'm sorry, you happen to be members of the media here, some of you are more balanced, some of you, do care about human rights and harms that can be caused to individuals if wrong information, inaccurate information, dis and misinformation, plays a role.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else just thoughts on?
Can I just say something?
Yes, Senator.
Talking about the role of media, like we're all, there's certain words that they use which we find as Muslim very offensive. Islamism. What does that mean? Where did that word come from? And yet, even if you tell people, they continue to use language which is offensive to Muslims, they continue to use that. On the other hand, I want to point out that if a Muslim does something, always a Muslim terrorist, Islamic terrorist. But I want to point out that in the case of the attack on the Quebec mosque or the Afzal family that was killed in London, Ontario, not one Muslim raised the issue of the terrorist religion. Not one Muslim did that. Nobody raised that issue. And Muslims, I think, deserve the same respect. That when a crazy person does something crazy, let's call it out for being a crazy person, for being a terrorist. Let's not attach religion to them. And we find that religion is always attached to Muslims if they do something.
We've got time for one more short comment, Monia.
Well, I certainly agree with what Nuzhat said about the Islamophobic sort of industry, Islamophobia industry. When we talk about an industry, that means there are actors, there are people there are profits, there is money, there are dividends. And unfortunately, media is part of this big scheme of systemic Islamophobia. So there is the Islamophobia on the street that maybe is coming from some sort of an ignorant, angry, hateful person, but it has been nourished by more insidious, more structured Islamophobia, where some politicians belong actually, to some of these groups. They are being funded. There are speakers. In the United States, I'm maybe less aware of such an organized Islamophobia industry in Canada, but in the United States, there are speakers, and they receive thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to go and big think tanks to produce material to be disseminated everywhere, movies, CDs. So yes, it is a big task. It is certainly a big task if it is only put on the shoulders of Muslims themselves to dismantle. It is a matter of everyone. I'm very sad and not much surprised when Senator Salma said at the beginning that they felt a little bit alone or isolated in their work. And as if, it is only Muslim who should carry this work. Whereas I think it is a society problem. It is an international problem as well. And we have to tackle it at every level, whether it is a school, whether it is workplace, government, international policies, wars that target Muslim country more than others. So I think
Okay.
it is difficult and we should work together.
Thanks, Monia. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you, everybody. So that is all the time we have for questions today. Thanks to our audience members for your interventions. Thank you, Senator Ataullahjan. We wish you all the best in your committee's report on Islamophobia and eagerly await that. Thank you, Nuzhat Jafri, Monia Mazigh, and Karl Nerenberg for being part of this important discussion today. And of course, thank you to my co-host, Libby, Davies. We will be back in November for our next Off the Hill panel, which will be all about cannabis, the economics, the politics, and the impacts of legalization. Be sure to get an invitation for that by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/alerts. And finally, thank you as always to Rabble for creating a space to host these important discussions. We encourage you all to help Rabble out by becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you next month.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.